You're the most ungrateful woman I've ever known.
Then dessert should be unforgettable. What are these
The carving knife was still in my hand when my husband, Greg, raised his glass of Pinot Noir and told his entire family I was the most ungrateful woman he'd ever met. He smiled, they nodded in solemn agreement, but by the time I served the pumpkin pie, their lives would be in absolute ruins. For a long time, I thought I had the perfect marriage. Greg was a charismatic, smooth-talking commercial real estate broker, and I, Sophie, was an introverted freelance illustrator who preferred the quiet comfort of my studio to the bustling networking events he thrived in. We balanced each other out, or so I believed. We had been married for 6 years, and for the first 4, things were genuinely idyllic. The foundation of our life together was the house. It wasn't just any house, it was a sprawling, beautifully restored 1920s Craftsman in a highly sought-after neighborhood in Seattle. I didn't buy it with Greg. I inherited it from my father, Arthur, who had passed away unexpectedly just a year before Greg and I met. My dad spent 20 years painstakingly restoring every inch of that house, the mahogany wainscoting, the stained glass transom windows, the wraparound porch. He owned it free and clear, and when he died, he left it entirely to me. It was my sanctuary, my remaining piece of him, and the sole reason Greg and I lived without a mortgage. Because we had no housing costs, you would think we'd be rolling in savings. But over the last 2 years, money had become a constant, suffocating issue. The market is cooling, Chloe, Greg would sigh, rubbing his temples over his morning coffee. Commercial leases are down. I need you to tighten the belt this month. Cancel that Adobe subscription upgrade. Maybe skip the premium groceries. I trusted him implicitly. If my husband, the financial expert, said we were struggling, then we were struggling. I took on more freelance commissions, worked late into the night, and handed over my earnings to our joint account, which Greg managed. I wore clothes from 3 seasons ago and stopped going out for lunches. Meanwhile, Greg's family seemed to be thriving, and they never missed an opportunity to flaunt it. There was Barbara, my mother-in-law, a woman whose entire personality was built around country club memberships she could no longer legitimately afford. Then there was Natalie, Greg's older sister, a self-proclaimed lifestyle entrepreneur whose boutique businesses failed every 18 months, yet she somehow always had the capital for a new one. Finally, there was David, the youngest brother, a perpetual man-child who traded cars like baseball cards. They had never liked me. To Barbara, an illustrator wasn't a real career. She frequently referred to my job as my little arts and crafts hobby. They viewed me as a stingy recluse who was holding Greg back from his true potential. The truth began to unravel exactly 10 days before Thanksgiving. I was looking for our old tax returns because I was applying for a small business grant. Greg was away on a networking retreat in Aspen. His home office was usually off limits. He called it his client confidentiality zone, but I just needed the 1,040 forms. I opened his filing cabinet. It was locked, which was odd. I found the spare key hidden in his desk organizer. When I opened the drawer, there were no tax returns. Instead, there was a thick blue folder from a bank we didn't use. My heart did a strange, cold flutter as I pulled it out. It was a home equity line of credit, HELOC agreement, for $450,000, against my house. I stared at the paperwork, the blood rushing in my ears like a freight train. The deed to the house was in a trust my trust. Greg's name wasn't on it. How could he take out a loan? I flipped to the signature page. There, in jagged, poorly replicated cursive, was my signature. Beside it was the stamp of a notary public, a man named Thomas Sterling, someone I had never met in my life. Greg had forged my signature. He had literally stolen the equity of my father's house. A physical wave of nausea hit me. I sank into Greg's expensive leather chair, gasping for air. Where did almost $500,000 go? I spent the next 12 hours tearing through his digital life. I guessed the passcode to his backup iPad. It was his mother's birthday, naturally, and found the digital trail. The money hadn't been lost in bad stocks or hidden in an offshore account. It had been systematically distributed to his family. There were wire transfers. $120,000 to Natalie's LLC to fund her new holistic wellness spa. $85,000 paid directly to a luxury car dealership for David's new Porsche Cayenne. And worst of all, $200,000 used as a massive down payment for a luxury waterfront condo for Barbara because her knees were simply too weak for stairs in her old townhouse. Greg hadn't just robbed me. He had robbed the legacy my father built to play the big shot savior for his entitled family. And the most sickening part? According to the text messages on the iPad, they all knew exactly where the money came from, and they despised me anyway. I read a text from Natalie to Greg dated 3 months prior. Is Sophie going to throw a fit about the spa investment? You know how cheap she is. Greg's reply, what she doesn't know won't hurt her. The house was just sitting there doing nothing anyway. She's so clueless about finances. She thinks we're practically broke. Don't worry about her. Barbara had chimed in on a group chat. Thank God my son is smart enough to handle the business in that marriage. If it were up to Sophie, she'd hoard it all while her own family suffered. You deserve a wife who understands family loyalty, Gregory. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. A strange, icy calm washed over me. I looked at the calendar on the wall. Thanksgiving was in a week and a half, and I was hosting. They were all coming to my house, the house they had secretly mortgaged to fund their lavish lives, to eat the food I was going to pay for. I carefully put everything back exactly as I found it. I took photos of every document, every text message, and every bank transfer. I sent them to a secure cloud server and immediately contacted my father's old estate lawyer, a ruthless shark of a woman named Miriam. By the time Greg returned from Aspen, kissing my cheek and complaining about how much the trip cost him, the trap was already set. Thanksgiving morning arrived with a bitter frost over Seattle. I was up at 5 a.m., meticulously prepping a 20-pound turkey, roasting butternut squash, and kneading dough for homemade rolls. If this was going to be my last meal with the family, I was going to ensure it was an absolute masterpiece. Greg wandered into the kitchen around 9 a.m., looking refreshed and handsome in a cashmere sweater. Smells incredible in here, babe, he said, wrapping his arms around my waist from behind. I stiffened. It took every ounce of my willpower not to drive my elbow into his ribs. Just trying to make it special for your family, Greg, I replied, my voice dangerously steady. They appreciate it, Chloe. I know Mom can be a little tough, but she really respects how hard you try. And listen, he lowered his voice, playing the role of the stressed provider. Let's try not to bring up money today, okay? David is feeling a bit insecure about his career right now, and I just want today to be peaceful. David is insecure about his career? I thought. He just bought an $85,000 car with my dead father's money. Of course, honey. Money is the last thing on my mind, I lied smoothly. At 2 p.m., the doorbell rang. The invasion had begun. Barbara walked in first, enveloped in a cloud of overpowering Chanel No. 5. She handed me a cheap $10 bottle of wine, despite knowing I loved full-bodied reds. Sophie, dear, you look tired. I suppose all this cooking takes it out of you when you aren't used to hard work. It's good to see you too, Barbara. Nice coat. Is that new? I asked, eyeing the full-length Burberry trench she was wearing. She touched the lapel smugly. Oh, an early Christmas gift from Greg. He takes such good care of his mother. I glanced at Greg. He offered a tight, sheepish smile. Right. My house paid for that coat. Next came Natalie, dragging her two unruly boys, who immediately began touching the antique glass lamps with sticky hands. She breezed past me, carrying nothing. I would have brought a side dish, Sophie, but I've just been so swamped with the spa launch. Being a business owner is just 24/7, you know? Not that you'd understand, working in your pajamas all day. I totally understand, I said, offering a serene smile. Starting a business requires a lot of capital. Natalie paused, a momentary flicker of confusion crossing her face, before she scoffed and walked into the living room. Finally, David arrived. I watched through the front window as he parked the gleaming white Porsche Cayenne in my driveway. He strutted up the steps, jingling the keys. Hey, Chloe, he smirked. Driveway's looking a little cracked out there. You guys need to get that patched. Ruins the curb appeal of the neighborhood. I'll look into it, David. Maybe I can take out a loan, I said, holding his gaze just a second longer than was comfortable. He chuckled nervously and pushed past me. For the next 3 hours, I endured a masterclass in passive-aggressive torture. I floated between the kitchen and the dining room, listening to them praise Greg for being the ultimate provider. Barbara bragged loudly to anyone who would listen about her new waterfront condo, gushing over the floor-to-ceiling windows and the granite countertops. It's just so nice to finally have a place that reflects my tastes, Barbara announced, sipping the good scotch Greg had poured her. And Greg handled all the tedious financial paperwork. He's a saint. Really, Sophie, you are so lucky to have a man who understands the complexities of the real estate market. You'd be lost without him. I would be, I agreed, setting down a platter of charcuterie. Greg has certainly taught me a lot about real estate this year. Truly eye-opening. Greg shot me a warning look. I just smiled and returned to the kitchen. By 5:30 p.m., the dining room table was set. It looked like a magazine spread. Crystal goblets, silver cutlery, a massive golden brown turkey sitting in the center, surrounded by sage stuffing, cranberry relish, and glazed carrots. We all sat down. Greg carved the turkey, playing the patriarch to perfection. The wine poured, and the conversation flowed, mostly consisting of Natalie complaining about her employees and David bragging about his car's horsepower. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. Greg stood up, tapping his silver spoon against his crystal wine glass. Clink, clink, clink. The table fell silent. I want to make a toast, Greg began, looking around the table with misty, theatrical eyes. This has been a transitional year for all of us. There have been ups and downs. But looking around this table, I am reminded of the power of family. He raised his glass toward his mother. Mom, your resilience inspires me every day. Enjoy your beautiful new home. He nodded to his sister. Natalie, your ambition is unmatched. The spa is going to be a triumph. He looked at his brother. David, I'm proud of the man you're becoming. Keep driving forward. Then, Greg turned to me. His expression shifted from warm adoration to a look of pained, patient martyrdom. And to my wife, Sophie, he said, his voice carrying a patronizing edge. I know this year has been hard for you. I know you don't always understand the sacrifices I have to make to keep this family afloat. I know you get frustrated when I ask you to contribute more, or when you feel like my family takes priority. Sometimes, Sophie, you can be, well, a bit ungrateful for the life I provide for us. A heavy silence dropped over the room. Barbara gave a slow, self-righteous nod. Natalie looked at her plate to hide a smirk. David just took a long gulp of his wine. But, Greg continued, his voice swelling with magnanimity, marriage is about patience. It's about teaching one another. And I hope, in time, you'll learn what it truly means to be generous and what it means to put family first. Happy Thanksgiving. He raised his glass. The family murmured, Happy Thanksgiving, pointedly refusing to look at me. I sat there at the head of the table, the carving knife still resting near my hand. I looked at the man I had slept next to for 6 years. I looked at the mother-in-law who thought I was a peasant. I looked at the siblings who had happily drained my father's legacy. My pulse was remarkably steady. The illusion was fully shattered, and all that was left was the cold, hard truth. I stood up. Thank you, Greg, I said softly. My voice echoed slightly in the large dining room. That was a beautiful speech. Truly moving. I picked up my napkin and dabbed the corners of my mouth. In fact, your words about generosity and family loyalty have really inspired me. So much so that I've prepared a special dessert for everyone tonight. It's a little unconventional, but I think it's exactly what this family deserves. Sophie, sit down, Greg muttered, his smile slipping slightly. He could hear the steel in my voice, a tone he wasn't accustomed to. Oh no, let her speak, Gregory, Barbara said, leaning back in her chair with a superior look. Let's hear what Sophie has to say about generosity. This should be rich. Rich is exactly the right word, Barbara, I replied, holding her gaze until she looked away. I turned on my heel and walked out of the dining room. I walked down the hallway to my study. The house was quiet outside of the faint murmur of confused voices drifting from the dining room. I unlocked the heavy oak door of my office, walked over to my desk, and picked up the stack of heavy manila envelopes I had prepared 3 days ago. There were 4 envelopes in total, one for Greg, one for Barbara, one for Natalie, one for David. Inside each envelope were copies of the forged HELOC documents, the wire transfer receipts, the text message printouts, and a formal legal letter from Miriam, my attorney. But I wasn't just going to hand them over. That would be too easy. I carried the envelopes back to the kitchen. I plated the homemade pumpkin pie, placing a generous dollop of vanilla bean whipped cream on each slice. Then, I placed a manila envelope under each dessert plate, like a horrifying little placemat. I loaded the plates onto a large serving tray and pushed through the swinging door back into the dining room. The conversation stopped abruptly as I entered. Greg was rubbing his jaw, looking annoyed. Sophie, what is this? We aren't done with our wine yet. I think you'll want to make room for this, I said brightly, moving around the table. I set the first plate, and its corresponding envelope, in front of David. I set the second in front of Natalie, the third in front of Barbara, and finally, the thickest envelope went in front of Greg. What on earth is this? Barbara asked, pushing her pie plate aside to stare at the envelope. Is this a game, Sophie? Because I really don't have the patience for parlor tricks. No tricks, Barbara, I said, returning to my seat at the head of the table. I didn't sit down. I rested my hands on the back of my chair, looking down at all of them. Consider it an invoice. Or a receipt. Actually, let's call it an eviction notice. Greg's face drained of color. He looked at the envelope, then up at me, his eyes wide with sudden, panicked realization. Sophie, wait. Open them, I commanded, dropping the sweet, wifely tone completely. My voice snapped like a whip across the room. David, oblivious to the tension, tore his open first. He pulled out the stack of papers, his brow furrowing as he looked at the top sheet. What is this? A bank statement? Why do you have a copy of the wire transfer for my car? Natalie opened hers next, pulling out the printed text messages. Her eyes scanned the page, and her hand flew to her mouth. Barbara clumsily fumbled with the clasp of her envelope. She pulled out the HELOC agreement. A home equity line of credit for $450,000? Sophie, what kind of massive debt have you gotten yourself into? I didn't get into debt, Barbara, I said, my voice eerily calm. Your son did. I turned my gaze to Greg, who was staring at his unopened envelope like it was a live bomb. He was visibly sweating, his charming facade melting away to reveal the coward underneath. Tell them, Greg, I whispered into the deafening silence of the room. Tell your family how generous you've been. Sophie, please. Greg choked out, his voice cracking. Let's go into the other room. We can talk about this. Don't do this here. Oh, we are absolutely doing this here, I shouted, slamming my hands down on the back of the chair. The crystal glasses on the table rattled. Barbara jumped in her seat. You wanted to talk about generosity, Greg? You wanted to humiliate me in front of your family? Well, let's air it all out. I pointed a trembling finger at David. That Porsche sitting in my driveway? The $85,000 you paid for it didn't come from Greg's bonus. It came out of the equity of my dead father's house. David's jaw dropped. He looked at Greg, horrified. Bro, what is she talking about? I pivoted to Natalie. Your holistic spa? The $120,000 investment? That wasn't Greg believing in your entrepreneurial spirit. That was stolen money. Stolen? Natalie gasped, dropping the papers onto her pie. Greg, tell me she's lying. Greg squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head frantically. It's complicated, Nat. It was a bridge loan. I was going to pay it back. A bridge loan? I laughed. A harsh, bitter sound that barely felt like my own. I looked at Barbara, who was staring at the forged signature on the document. And your beautiful new waterfront condo, Barbara. The $200,000 down payment. Did Greg tell you he forged my signature on a legal document, bribed a dirty notary, and mortgaged the only thing my father left me to pay for it? Barbara's face went from pale to a dangerous shade of crimson. Gregory, she breathed, her voice trembling. Is this true? Did you put a lien on her house to buy my condo? Mom, I was trying to help you, Greg cried, standing up, his hands pleading. You said you couldn't live in the townhouse anymore. The business has been slow for 2 years. I was drowning. I had to keep up appearances. The house was paid off. It was just sitting there. I was going to invest some money, make it back, and pay off the loan before Sophie ever found out. By forging my signature? I asked, pulling my phone from my pocket. By committing felony wire fraud and identity theft. The word felony hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. You guys knew, I said, looking at Natalie and Barbara. I read the texts. You knew the money was coming from my house. You just didn't care, because Greg convinced you I was a cheap, ungrateful wife who was withholding funds. We didn't know he forged it! Natalie shrieked, tears suddenly spilling down her face. He told us you agreed to it. He told us you were finally stepping up to help the family, but that you didn't want us to mention it because you were being sensitive about your dad's memory. I paused. I looked at Greg. The absolute depravity of his lies was staggering. He hadn't just stolen from me. He had spun a web of deception so thick that even his greedy family thought I was a willing participant, albeit a reluctant one. Is that true? I asked Barbara. Barbara, for the first time since I met her, looked at me with something resembling horror rather than disdain. He, he told us, you co-signed the loan. Sophie, he said you realized family was more important than an old house. We thought, we thought you were just being quiet about it to maintain control. Well, I said, taking a deep breath, feeling the power shift entirely to my side of the room. He lied. To all of you. He stole my money to buy your love, and he bought you all stolen goods. I tapped the legal letter sitting on top of Greg's pile. That letter is from my attorney, I announced, my voice ringing clear and authoritative. As of 9 a.m. Monday morning, I am filing for divorce. I am also filing a police report for forgery and fraud against Greg. Greg collapsed back into his chair, burying his face in his hands, letting out a pathetic, animalistic sob. But that's not all, I continued, looking at his family. Because the funds used to purchase the Porsche, the spa equipment, and the condo down payment were obtained through fraudulent means, my lawyer will be placing liens on all of those assets to recoup the stolen equity. David, the car is gone. Natalie, your business accounts will be frozen. And Barbara, you're going to lose the condo. The dining room erupted into absolute chaos. The dining room erupted into absolute chaos, a beautiful symphony of panic and betrayal that I had orchestrated down to the final note. David was the first to break the shock, leaping from his chair so violently it tipped backward and crashed onto the hardwood floor. My car? You're taking my car? Greg, you told me that was a signing bonus from the commercial firm. You told me it was clean money. It was, Greg stammered, holding his hands up defensively. I mean, it wasn't, but I was going to pay it back before the audit. David, you have to understand. You were whining about how embarrassed you were driving that Honda to your tech interviews. So you stole from your wife to buy me a Porsche? David screamed, grabbing his hair in fists. They're going to repossess it. My neighbors are going to see me get towed. Natalie was hyperventilating, clutching her chest as her perfectly manicured nails dug into the expensive silk of her blouse. My LLC. Greg, I have investors. I have employees. If her lawyer freezes my accounts, I'm ruined. I will literally face civil suits for breach of contract. You promised me this capital was from your private investment portfolio. I am your brother, Greg yelled back, his charming facade completely shattered, replaced by the cornered, desperate animal he truly was. I gave you everything. Both of you. You begged me for money and I found a way to get it. By committing a federal crime, Natalie shrieked, throwing her slice of pumpkin pie at him. It missed his face but splattered across the chest of his expensive cashmere sweater, leaving a glaring orange stain. You absolute idiot! But the most spectacular reaction belonged to Barbara. For a woman who prided herself on loyalty and family above all else, I expected her to rush to Greg's defense, to coddle her golden boy, and tell him we would figure it out together. Instead, the matriarch's true colors finally bled through. She slowly stood up, her face a mask of cold, unadulterated fury. She didn't look at me. She locked her piercing gaze solely on her son. Gregory, she hissed, her voice dropping an octave. The room instantly fell silent. Do you have any idea what you have done to me? Mom, please, Greg begged, tears streaming down his face, reaching a hand out toward her. I just wanted you to have the waterfront view. I wanted you to be happy. Barbara slapped his hand away so hard the crack echoed in the high-ceilinged room. You stupid, arrogant little boy, she spat, her words dripping with venom. I sold my townhouse to pay for the designer furniture and the custom drapery for that condo. I put everything I had left into the renovations. If I lose that condo, I have nothing. I will be on the street, and it will be your fault. Mom, Greg whispered, utterly broken by the realization that his family's love was entirely conditional on his ability to fund them. Don't call me Mom, she snapped, grabbing her purse from the floor. She turned to me, her eyes wide and pleading, completely abandoning her high society pride. Sophie, please, listen to me. You know I had no part in this. You read the texts. We didn't know he forged the documents. You can't take the condo, you simply can't. I looked at the woman who had spent 6 years belittling my career, insulting my home, and treating me like an unpaid servant. I don't want your condo, Barbara, I said, my voice perfectly level. I want the $200,000 of my father's equity that is currently sitting in your property's deed. If you can write me a check for that amount today, you can keep it. She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. She didn't have the money. We both knew it. Then I suggest you start packing, I told her, turning my attention back to the rest of the room. I walked over to the front windows and pulled the heavy velvet curtains back. In fact, I suggest all of you start packing. The meal is over. Sophie, we need to talk about this, Greg pleaded, stumbling toward me, ignoring the pie dripping down his sweater. We're married. We can go to counseling. I'll take on a second job. I'll pay back every cent, I swear to you. Just, please don't call the police. It'll ruin my career. I'll lose my broker's license. You should have thought about your license before you hired a dirty notary to steal my identity, I replied, stepping out of his reach. Get out of my house, Greg. No, he said, shaking his head stubbornly, trying to summon a shred of authority. This is my house, too. We are legally married. You can't just throw me out on Thanksgiving. I smiled. It was a cold, sharp thing. Actually, this house is in a protective trust established before our marriage, of which I am the sole beneficiary, I reminded him. And knowing you'd try to pull this, I made a few preparations yesterday. I walked to the front door and threw it open. Sitting on the wraparound porch, illuminated by the amber glow of the outdoor sconces, were 4 large suitcases and 3 garbage bags filled with Greg's clothes, golf clubs, and personal files. I packed your things, I said, pulling a spare set of car keys from my pocket and tossing them at his feet. Your name is off the joint accounts. Your credit cards have been frozen. You can take the old Honda. I kept the garage clicker. Greg stared at the suitcases, the reality of his situation finally crushing him under its immense weight. His family was abandoning him. His wife was evicting him. His career was effectively over. Let's go, David, Barbara snapped, marching toward the door, wrapping her new Burberry coat tightly around herself. She didn't even look at Greg as she passed him. I am not spending another minute in this madhouse. Natalie grabbed her 2 bewildered sons and followed her mother out, shooting Greg one final glare of absolute disgust. David shoved past him a second later, marching toward his beloved Porsche with his shoulders slumped. Greg stood alone in the hallway, looking completely hollowed out. Sophie, he whispers, one last pathetic attempt at sympathy. Happy Thanksgiving, Greg, I said softly. I shut the heavy oak door in his face and turned the deadbolt. Click. The silence that settled over the house was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I walked back into the dining room. The 20-pound turkey sat untouched. The crystal goblets caught the light of the chandelier. I sat down at the head of the table, pulled a slice of pumpkin pie toward me, and took a bite. It was sweet, rich, and perfect. The following Monday was a masterclass in swift, merciless legal retribution. At exactly 9 a.m., my attorney, Miriam, filed the divorce papers. At 10 a.m., we were at the precinct filing a formal police report for felony identity theft, wire fraud, and grand larceny against Greg. Miriam, a woman who operated with the precision of a military sniper, had already compiled the digital footprint from Greg's backup iPad, the forged HELOC documents, and the damning text messages from his family. The police didn't have to work hard to build the case. The evidence was overwhelming. Revenge is often messy, but when executed with perfect documentation, it is an absolute work of art. Miriam, my attorney. Within 48 hours, Greg's life systematically unraveled. The commercial real estate firm he worked for had a strict morals clause. The moment the police contacted them regarding the fraudulent financial documents, he was terminated immediately. The fallout for his family was equally devastating, precisely as I had promised. The asset seizures. David's pride and joy. 2 weeks before Christmas, a repo truck pulled up to David's apartment complex. Because the $85,000 down payment was flagged as stolen funds, the dealership aggressively reclaimed the Porsche Cayenne. David, having zero savings to fight it in court, had to watch from his window as his status symbol was hauled away into the snow. He now takes the bus to his sporadic job interviews. Natalie's empire. Her holistic wellness spa collapsed before it even officially opened. With her business accounts frozen pending the fraud investigation, she couldn't pay her contractors or her initial lease. Her investors sued her for gross negligence, and she was forced to declare personal bankruptcy to avoid total ruin. Barbara's downfall. This was the sweetest justice of all. Miriam placed an immediate lien on the waterfront condo. Because Barbara had liquidated her own assets to furnish the place, she couldn't afford to buy out my equity. The condo was forced into a short sale. Barbara had to pack up her designer furniture and move into a cramped two-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city, sharing the rent with her now unemployed son, Greg. As for Greg, the criminal justice system didn't take kindly to white-collar fraud. He tried to claim I gave him verbal permission to sign the documents, but the corrupt notary he used eventually caved under police pressure. The notary confessed that Greg had paid him $5,000 in cash to look the other way and stamp the forged signature while I was out of town. Greg took a plea deal to avoid federal prison. He received 5 years of heavily monitored probation, a permanent felony record, and a court order for massive restitution. Because he lost his broker's license, he now works at a mid-tier hardware store, stocking shelves to slowly pay back the remaining balance of the stolen equity. I heard through mutual acquaintances that the atmosphere in their shared, tiny apartment is a living nightmare. Barbara constantly reminds Greg that he ruined her twilight years, while Greg blames his family's greed for pushing him to commit the crime. They got exactly what they deserved: each other. As for me, I am thriving. The bank, desperate to avoid a massive lawsuit over their failure to verify my identity during the loan process, settled out of court. They absorbed the loss of the HELOC, wiping the fraudulent debt from my father's house entirely. My sanctuary is safe, whole, and completely mine again. I poured all the trauma, anger, and eventual relief into my art. I illustrated a graphic novel about a woman who dismantles a cursed, haunted house from the inside out. It was picked up by a major publisher and spent 6 weeks on the bestseller list. Sometimes, on quiet Sunday mornings, I sit on my wraparound porch with a cup of premium coffee, looking out at the beautiful, restored woodwork my father spent 20 years perfecting. I don't wear clothes from 3 seasons ago anymore, and I certainly don't tighten my belt to fund anyone else's ego. My husband called me ungrateful. He thought I was weak, oblivious, and easily manipulated. He thought the quiet woman in the corner wouldn't notice the wolves at the door, but he forgot one crucial detail. I didn't just notice the wolves. I locked them inside, set the house on fire, and walked away with the keys. Thank you so much for reading this crazy story. If you love the drama, the twists, and seeing karma served on a silver platter, please smash that like button and share this video with anyone who loves a good revenge story. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss out on more shocking real-life tales. What would you have done in Sophie's shoes? Let me know in the comments below.